The World Trade Organization is a multilateral body which pops up frequently in discussions of development economics. Let's look at this a little more closely. The World Trade Organization, or WTO as it's often called, has two primary functions. The first is it oversees a series of trade agreements which individual nations sign on to when they join the WTO, and furthermore, the WTO is a forum for negotiating disputes, settling disputes, and then enforcing a trade dispute. In other words, the WTO is also a court, and it has a kind of police power, namely the ability to levy fines. A typical WTO case involves the United States and the European Union. The United States has charged that European governments gave unfair subsidies to Airbus, the major European maker of large planes, and that this placed the United States company of Boeing at a disadvantage. The initial ruling was in favor of the United States, although the case continues, and the question now is whether the European governments have in fact stopped those subsidies. In general, WTO cases tell countries they need to lower their tariffs or stop subsidizing their exporters, or in other ways abide by the rules of what is considered under the agreement to be some kind of fair world trading order. A few other facts about the WTO. As of 2012, it has 155 members, with 156th, Russia, on the way. These members include the world's major trading nations. The WTO dates from 1995, but before then something quite similar was called GATT, General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, and this was constructed in the immediate aftermath of World War II as a way of keeping the global trading order relatively free. Over time, more and more nations have entered into GATT and now WTO. There's something called the Doha Development Round that was launched in 2001, and the purpose of those talks has been to try to lower tariffs even further. But keep in mind that since World War II, a lot of tariffs have already come down quite a bit, except for the area of agriculture, and getting further gains on lowering tariffs at this point actually has proven fairly difficult. The WTO is based in Geneva, Switzerland, and there's also a part of it which overlooks intellectual property, and that's called TRIPS, which is an acronym for Council for Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights. Let's look at some of the general principles embodied initially in GATT, and they have essentially been carried over into WTO. First is the idea of non-discrimination, that a trade break or tariff reduction extended to one nation should, as much as possible, be applied to other countries as well. There's the idea of reciprocity, namely that countries would mutually bargain for greater trade and reduction in tariffs. Commitments are considered binding and enforceable, and trade policy is supposed to be as transparent as possible. Note finally that both under GATT and now WTO, if a trade restriction survives WTO, in some ways this strengthens that trade restriction because it's shown it's okay under international rules of order, and the clear example here would be restrictions on trade in agricultural products. Sometimes the very process of joining WTO can be quite important. The process can take a long time, 5 years or more, and when China applied to join WTO, they had to make a lot of economic and legal changes in order to be eligible. According to one estimate, they had to dismantle at least 7,000 different barriers to trade. Russia, which is now seeking to join the WTO, is having to reform its economy in similar ways. These are considered some of the benefits of having WTO, namely that it gives developing nations some reason to move toward freer trade policies. Of course, for the same reason, the WTO has its share of critics. Most economists are strong advocates of free trade, but not all commentators and observers agree with this perspective, and those individuals who favor trade protectionism for developing nations tend to be strong critics of WTO. Over time, the WTO seems to matter somewhat less. The first key point is that a lot of progress in reducing trade barriers today, it comes in the form of bilateral agreements rather than multilateral agreements for the entire world. So the United States and Costa Rica may make a deal, the United States and South Korea or Colombia may make a deal, but these are country-to-country deals, and over time we've seen more and more progress coming in that form rather than through WTO. The second point is that the major remaining areas of trade barriers for a lot of countries are agricultural subsidies and sometimes tariffs, and those seem to be persisting. WTO has not really been able to crack those. Finally, there's a paper by economist Andrew Rose, and the title of his paper is, "Do we really know that the WTO increases trade?" And he looked at the numbers and he argued that there's actually an ambiguity here. Most countries are reducing tariffs and trade barriers over time anyway, and it's not clear that joining earlier GATT and now WTO makes that big a difference. There's been a lot of debate around this paper, and economists disagree as to what's the correct statistical model here. But the mere fact that a serious paper could be written challenging whether the WTO makes a difference at all is here the important point. When you read the popular press, when you read some of the critics, you often see a quite sensationalistic treatment of the WTO, as if it is some major force ruling the world order and destroying democracy and forcing developing nations to do all kinds of things they don't want to do. When you look at the evidence, it seems the WTO really may have some marginal impact on freer trade and encouraging countries to join and encouraging countries to get rid of their trade barriers. But in general, a lot of the popular discussions of the WTO, especially the negative ones, have an exaggerated sense simply of how much power the WTO has. By the way, for more information on all these topics, just Google the words on these various slides, starting with World Trade Organization. You can also read Andrew Rose's paper, but there's plenty about the WTO online. And if you go to news.google.com and put in World Trade Organization, you can see what's new with the latest cases.